We have to look for long time frames, and we have to make assessments for people living in the far future. Again, we have here this scheme from present to future, taking into account environmental change. So the question is, can exposures be assessed for such long time frames? This is a question which is always on the table, which is always on top. And the question is, some people ask, what will people do, for example, in 10,000 years? And my answer is then, we don't know. But we know they will breathe, they will drink, they will eat, and they will stay outdoors or indoors. So they will do more things we do now to survive. They have to. The next question is, how much will people eat, drink, and breathe in 10,000 years or in other time in the far future? And again, we don't know. We really don't know. However, we know that they will need similar amounts of energy, similar amounts of protein, similar amounts of fat and of minerals. And they need similar amounts of drinking water, and they will breathe similar amounts, similar volumes of air. I think this is pretty sure. And if we don't start from these assumptions, the assessment doesn't make any sense. However, this assessment is made for people, and therefore this assumption makes sense. Because the exposure is influenced or controlled by a lot of physiological and biological processes. And all these processes, these physiological processes, were developed during the evolution of life over billions of years. And they are similar, or for all species, or let's say for most species. There are some very exotic species living in the ground of the deep ocean. They have maybe different processes, but all the processes on energy production in living cells, etc., on physiology, on metabolism, is the same. So many of these biological processes are really universal. They are similar on all continents. They are similar. They are controlled by same mechanisms. However, we know the manifestation of some processes depends on the environmental factors. They're not always the same, not everywhere the same, but they are driven by similar processes. And I think this is an important thing. And if you imagine that life developed since, let's say, the first start was maybe 1 billion years ago, and we have still the same or similar processes. And having this in mind, I think we can also go and look for periods which are 10,000 years away. Another important assumption is related to radiation protection criteria. These criteria have been derived for present-day populations. They are based on current knowledge of radiation risks. And this is important to show on our current knowledge. And one paradigm is always that we say also future generations should not be exposed to higher risks as we are now. However, there may be some progress in future in medicine which may modify the radiosensitivity of people, which may also modify biokinetics of radionuclides in humans. Maybe not completely change, but modify. It may also improve the success of treatment of radiation-related diseases. So there might be some optimism that radiation risks may be lower in the far future, but we don't know that. And that's why such changes are not anticipated in the assessment. All of these safety assessments are based on use a basic exposure scenario and some basic assumption. First of all, first important assumption is the subsistence farming. This means all food which is consumed in the far future is produced on the area with the highest impact of radionuclides released from the disposal facility. This is a very conservative assumption, because any other assumption regarding food supply will cause lower exposures via intake of food. This is for sure. So we cannot do more. Just to assume that all food consumed is produced locally. The second one is regarding the agricultural practice. If we look at, and this means the spectrum of crops and domestic animals should comply with site characteristics. And the soil properties should allow the cultivation of crops. And also the use of fertilizer should ensure long-term fertility of the soil. This is also important because this means we will not have fish production in a desert because there is no water. Such as simple as that. Further on, if we have a real desert, like the Sahara Desert or the Gobi Desert, if we should assume such a future environment, we cannot assume that there is some agriculture, because for agriculture you need water, you need soil, and we will not assume that in future such limitations of biology will really be overcome. And the third one is also the sustainability of land use. This means the scenarios considered should not assume issues, should not make assumptions which are impossible. And for example, if the irrigation water has a too high salt content of salt, of calcium, of sodium, it cannot be used for irrigation and it cannot be used for drinking water. And also the overall availability of water in the scenario should be considered. Okay, now how to address environmental changes when assessing exposures for the far future? There are a number of factors which have an impact on the post-closure assessment. First of all, there's the climate, agricultural practice, soil, technology, lifestyle. All these have some impact on the post-closure exposure. So let's have a look what the impact of that might be. Let's start with the lifestyle, with the food supply. I mean, this has already been addressed. The basic scenario assumes a complete self-supply. This means 100% of the food consumed is produced locally. This is a pessimistic assumption. And lower degrees of self-supply imply lower exposures to people. So this means this 100% assumption makes sure that doses are not underestimated because we use other. This is regarding the food supply, this is the most conservative assumption. And regarding the food intake, we have already seen that demand of energy, fat, and protein will remain more or less constant. There's a physiological constraint. Of course, the spectrum of crops of food may vary. It also varies today from country to country, from continent to continent, and therefore the impact of different diets can be explored by such sensitivity analysis, where you assume, let's say, specific diets for specific situations or for specific countries, or you compare the impact of diets in different countries. So the lifestyle, by and large, has some influence, but not really a very dominating influence. Let's look for the agricultural practice. This may also change. In a previous slide, we have discussed something about sustainability. This is important to assume because for this long time we looked really at the future and also for long time frames for irrigation of 100 years or more years. So this requires sustainable agricultural practice. It means extreme conditions which would allow agricultural use only for a short period of time are not considered. And as today, we assume that soil cultivation will try to achieve favorable conditions for plant growth. This means pH value between 5 and 7.5, depending on the crop and the soil. And also the agriculture will try to allow to ensure porosity of soil for exchange of air and drainage of water. Of course, this last point does not apply to the rice cultivation because this is our flooded culture. So, and also the agricultural practice should be consistent with site-specific conditions. The practices assumed should be consistent. For example, we will have not irrigation on sites with sufficient precipitation. And for example, for arid climates, we will not use, or we will use only I'm sorry. We will always adopt the husbandry of domestic animals to the climate. For example, husbandry of sheep, which are used to arid climates, will be assumed for arid climates. The technology, of course, there may be changes, as we all experience in the last years and decades. And these changes in technology cannot be explicitly taken into consideration. However, we assume that agricultural activities will ensure sustainability of land use, and this is a universal requirement. And we will also assume that crops will be grown on soil and not in nutrient solutions, for example. However, if they would grow in nutrient solutions, we would have other techniques, and nutrient solutions are not used for long periods of time, maybe for 1 or 2 or 3 years, but not for 10 or 100 years. So the assumption that crops will be grown on soil is also a conservative, pessimistic assumption. Cultivation nutrients would lead to lower doses. The climate change. This is a key element of long-term safety assessments. Why is this the case? The climate has impact on many factors. What I see here is characterized by the temperature with seasonal and daily variations, the days of frost, etc., and the precipitation, and also again the seasonal and daily variations. This has a strong impact on the plant growth. First of all, determines the length of the vegetation period. It has a big influence on the crops grown, on the yield of crops, on the demand for irrigation, and also on the animal you can raise in an area. Finally, it had also an impact on the Earth's surface due to the impact on hydrology and hydrogeology. The weathering of rocks is largely controlled by climatic conditions. Also, the development of soil is controlled by climatic conditions. And it has also a huge impact on wind and water erosion. Climate is really a key element. How to address climate? You see here is a map of the world with the different climates from polar to tropical, covering a wide spectrum of environmental conditions. So there are different options to reflect future developments. Again, if we start from present conditions, we have the option A and option B. The option A we call an analog approach. In this analog approach, we use data from present day conditions of neighboring sites, which cover a wide range of climates. I mean, neighboring sites in this term means sites in the area in the radius of about 3,000 or 4,000 kilometers, it depends on. And then we say, okay, if we have, let's, for example, give an example, a site in Europe, in the middle of Europe, we use present day conditions for Northern Europe, present day conditions for Southern Europe, and then we say, within this spectrum, within this range, we will also see, or this range will cover also future conditions. I will explain this in more detail later. And this option B is different. This is based on a dynamic analysis of climate. And this tries to model the evolution of the biosphere in response to the main environmental change drivers. So, what is the climate what was it in the past? How will it develop in the future? I will also give a presentation on that after that to discuss this in more detail. Okay. So option A is use of data for present-day conditions at a range of different sites with different climates and also characteristics. And the key assumption is that the sites are considered suitable analogs for future developments. And it is assumed that the set of analog biosphere systems adequately captures the range of future systems. So that we have, so to say, an envelope for future developments. You see this, for example, described in the report on the right. There are also other publications. Number B, dynamic analysis of future biosphere systems is modeling the evolution of the biosphere in response to the main environmental change drivers, including the climate change, including geomorphological changes associated with sea level change at coastal sites, for example, and erosion areas of geological uplift. This is rather complex because it needs to model also the interactions of climate, hydrology, landform, radionuclides released from the geosphere, and radionuclide migration and accumulation, and the land use. I will also go to this in more detail in presentation number 4. And this is, for example, addressed in the publication, even on the left side. So the summary for that is this part. Safety assessments need to consider future developments. In principle, there's an inherent uncertainty to predict future conditions. However, biological processes are universal, following the same dependencies now and in the future. We have seen that climate is a key driver for environmental change and has impact on agriculture, soil development, and also on lifestyle. And for addressing future conditions, we have this option A. It's using current data from a wide range of current environmental sites, or option B, the dynamic modeling, climate, landscape. Okay, thank you very much so far.